A diplomatic dispute between NATO allies. Tensions soar between the US and Turkey as both sides impose sweeping travel restrictions. I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is the Turkey-US visa crisis. Tourists, students, journalists and business people all blocked from getting new visas to travel between the US and Turkey. So unless you're moving permanently, you're now not going at all. The announcement by the US that it was suspending visa services was met with a swift response from Turkey. It all happened after Turkey's arrest of a US consulate worker who the ambassador says was just doing his job, but who Turkey says is being investigated for links to terrorism. This dispute represents a new low in an alliance that's been under increasing strain for the past year. The Turkish Prime Minister says the crisis needs to be resolved immediately. But how? Yvette McCullough reports.
Close NATO allies facing off in a diplomatic spat, a tit-for-tat, with neither Turkey nor the United States looking likely to back down. The US made the first move on Sunday, releasing a statement saying that due to recent events, it was reassessing Turkey's commitment to the security of US missions and personnel, and as a result, it was suspending all non-immigrant visa services at facilities across Turkey. Just a few hours later, the Turkish government responded with a near-identical statement, announcing that it too was reassessing and suspending visa services. The US says it made the decision after a Turkish national working for its missions in Istanbul was detained. He's suspected of having links to the terrorist organisation FETÖ, a group that Turkey accuses of being behind the failed coup attempt last July.
This arrest has raised questions about whether the goal of some officials is to disrupt the long-standing cooperation between Turkey and the United States. We don't know if these arrests are singular events or if we should expect other Turkish staff members to be arrested.
But Turkey says the detainment is part of a judicial process and that the accused man does not hold diplomatic immunity.
Bütün bunlar defa İstanbul Başkonsolosluğunda bir şeylerin döndüğünü gösteriyor. Amerika'nın burada bir defa bir şeyi değerlendirmesi lazım. Bu ajanlar Amerikan Başkonsolosluğuna nasıl sızdı?
It's a great honor and privilege because he's become a friend of mine.
What a difference a few weeks can make. Just last month, US President Donald Trump was singing Turkey's and President Erdogan's praises on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly.
We have a great friendship. As countries, I think we're right now as close as we have ever been.
But those relations have reached a low point in what has been an up and down relationship for some time. Turkey has been pushing for the US to extradite Fethullah Gulen from his self-imposed exile in Pennsylvania. He's a businessman and cleric accused by Turkey of planning the coup attempt last year. But so far, that hasn't happened. Another sore point in the relations has been the US's support of the YPG in Syria. The YPG is the Syrian wing of the terrorist PKK, who have threatened Turkey's borders and taken thousands of Turkish lives. Turkey says the weapons provided to the YPG by the US are being used against its military. And in recent months, Turkey has also improved its relations with Russia, working with it and Iran to try find a peaceful solution to Syria's war. With the relationship between the US and Turkey looking fragile, will this dispute continue to escalate? Or will the once close NATO allies learn how to get along? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by former US Ambassador Matthew Breiser. In Washington, we have Lawrence Korb. He was an assistant to the former US Secretary of Defense. And in Ankara, Onur Erim. He's the chief advisor to Ankara's local government. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Matthew Breiser, let me begin with you. Suspension of visa services both ways. Is this a storm in a teacup, or is it something more worrying?
I think, well, it's a little bit more worrying in light of two factors. One, in my 23-year diplomatic career, I never heard anyone talk about using visa suspensions as a political tool. It's a blunt instrument that inconveniences and causes suffering for people who have nothing to do with the dispute. So and the people in the U.S. government know that. So they're really upset about something, number one. Number two, underlying this issue of the moment is very deep distress and stress on the U.S.-Turkey relationship, as we heard in the report just now. There's a long list of deeply problematic issues that have no resolution in the near term.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and we'll talk a bit more about those deep underlying issues in a few moments. Let me ask you, Onur Erim, quite directly, who is to blame for this row?
I don't think anybody has an answer to that question. But for this last incident that happened, the last decision made by the U.S. Embassy in Ankara, it seems, again, it seems very uncalled for to begin with. I was actually at a private dinner meeting with the ambassador 2 nights ago on Friday night. And when somebody raised a question regarding to the Turkish employee of the Istanbul consulate, he was very frustrated. And he used a term which I at that point didn't understand, but now makes more sense. He said, when the question was asked, what are you going to do? He said, there's a very old American sports term. He says, we say, don't get mad, get even. Now I understand what that actually meant. And hopefully this was something that was done out of frustration and will be settled back to its normality on both sides very soon.
Yeah, really interesting anecdote. Thanks for sharing that. Lawrence Korb, now Turkey feels, I guess, there's enough evidence to suspect that this person, Metin Topuz, was working for FETÖ, the Gulenists. On the other hand, you have the ambassador backing this person, John Bass. Do you think, Lawrence, that John Bass acted properly by issuing the visa suspension?
Well, I think so, because he was trying to protect someone who has been working for him and for the United States, and wanted to show that you just can't do that to people who are part of our delegation. And I think, as my colleague in Ankara, pointed out, as he told him, don't get mad, get even, because if he had just complained, then nothing would have happened. But by doing something, I think he has gotten the attention of the Turkish government and get them to act properly.
But Lawrence, at what cost? I mean, if this entire friendship unravels with this being the trigger, would it have been worth it?
Well, again, I hope that our relationship is much stronger. But as you talked about in the lead-up, there are a lot of other things going on. While President Trump did praise President Erdogan when he was here, the fact of the matter is that Turkish President Erdogan and many people in Turkey are very upset about the fact that we don't extradite Gulen, not recognizing that Trump can't do that by himself. Under our system, you have an independent judiciary, and they have not been able to present enough evidence. Plus, you had Erdogan's guards assaulting Americans who were peacefully protesting some of Erdogan's policies when he came here. So there's a lot of things going on. But you're quite right. We have got to get back together because our common interest overlay this. Turkey's still part of NATO. You're trying to get some sort of solution in Syria. You've got the whole Kurdish independence problem that you have to deal with. So hopefully we can get back to where we need to be and recognize that while we don't share everything completely, we do have a lot of critical issues in common.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's unpack some of these deeper issues. Let's look at initially what is directly, I guess, related to the potential extradition of Gulen. Let me ask you, Onur Erim, there seems to be a feeling from the Americans and others that Turkey is using people as political hostages, right? So they give the example of Andrew Brunson and President Erdogan's speech where he said, you have a pastor, we have a pastor. There's a kind of one-for-one, swap deal. The Germans have also sort of lightly accused Turkey of trying to do the same thing with Deniz Yücel. Do they have a case at all, Onur?
People have spent months, if not years, in Guantanamo with probably 1/1,000,000th of the evidence that's been presented about Gulen by the government of Turkey. But let's not discuss that. Let's go into a more deeper issue where a strategic partnership is being questioned. I think right now the biggest frustration on the Turkish side about in regards to Gulen issue is that there hasn't been anything at all done by the U.S. government. There hasn't been any questioning, There hasn't been any investigation towards this, or at least nothing that we know of. And I think the fact that the American judiciary system, or actually police forces, are hesitating to even question Gulen is what is deeply threatening the strategic partnership that Turkey and U.S. has enjoyed for almost 100 years right now, and more than that if you go back to Ottoman times. So what the American politicians are turning deaf ear to is something more than the judiciary system, that we are looking for signs of just partnership.
Right.
You know, just do something about Gulen. Whether Turkey is right or wrong, whether Turkey has presented enough evidence to U.S. or not is not a question.
Okay.
We're talking about hundreds of thousands of documents that has been sent there.
Certainly. So let me ask Matthew Breiser, right? Where does the...
So at least question this guy.
Okay, so where does the truth lie here? Where we have the one side saying we're giving all these documents, and according to the Turkish state, this is evidence. Whereas on the other hand, the Americans, from what we're hearing, they're going, well, it might not be smoking gun evidence, and then they're attaching peripheral issues like the pastor, Andrew Brunson, and others, and going, maybe you're trying to do a swap deal with us. Is this a miscommunication? What's the issue here? What's the problem here?
I think it's a misalignment of visions of the truth or of philosophies, meaning that for a Turkish citizen, regardless of political party affiliation, chances are you believe that Fethullah Gulen and his organization were behind the coup. Overwhelming public opinion says that, regardless of whether or not you like President Erdogan. And in the U.S. and the U.S. government, there still is doubt that Gulen is really behind it. And that's what really this issue comes down to, right? This guy, Metin Topuz, is accused by the Turkish government of having done a lot of liaising and coordinating with the Gulen organization, but not only with him, but with prosecutors and law enforcement officials who were accused by the Turkish government of being involved in earlier attempts to undermine the current government. So if the United States government then says, well, you have no right to question this guy. Why? Because he works for the U.S. government. That raises all sorts of suspicions. And the fact that maybe the U.S. was behind the coup plotting at worst, or at best, was so naive that it didn't understand that a member of this coup plotting organization was within its midst. So there's a misalignment of viewpoints in philosophy, more than communication.
And is it possible to ever get the two to match and meet?
It is if what Onur was just saying should happen now begins to happen. If people in Turkey begin to see evidence that the U.S. is really pushing on the Gülen extradition case. And by the way, my contacts in Washington for months have been suggesting that people are working on the case. But if it becomes known that there really is an effort to try to prosecute and extradite him, I think that will change the situation. But otherwise, you'll still have this YPG, Kurdish terrorist organization hanging over everyone's head in Syria, which will make things tough.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the YPG. Lawrence Korb, is that at the heart of it all? The fact that Turkey still can't understand why the US would be supporting the YPG when there's clear evidence that the YPG is the Syrian wing of the PKK. The PKK blows up civilians here. The PKK turns those arms against the Turkish state. Is that the fundamental difference at the heart of this dispute, underpinning all of this?
Well, I think the reason that the United States has allowed the Kurdish forces to become part of the Syrian Democratic Forces is because they're the only ones who were standing up to fight ISIS. The Russians, when they came in, claimed they were fighting ISIS. No, they were going after the people who rose up peacefully against Assad. And with the Kurdish fighters, basically, and the other people we were supporting in Syria, we took back Kobani and we're taking back Raqqa. That's no threat to Turkey. They are not allowing, the United States has in fact said, once this is over, they're going to take away the arms that they gave to these people.
But Lawrence, do you believe that?
I think the whole idea that...
Do you genuinely believe that the YPG is going to give the arms back to the Americans once they've defeated Daesh?
Well, I think the United States is going to take them back. I mean, so I don't think it's a question of them. And that there is no evidence. A lot of people are talking that the YPG is the same as the PKK. That's not true, okay? All Kurds are not the same. The Kurds we work with in Iraq are much different than the PKK. So the idea that all Kurds want the same thing is not true.
But nobody said,
in fact, then the United States sided with Turkey.
Certainly, nobody said that, and nobody said all Kurds are the same. And there is a clear distinction between the Kurds in Iraq and the PKK. Although you have to ignore a mountain of evidence in order to say the YPG has no connection to the PKK. I mean, it's the reality, right, Lawrence? I mean, it's there. It's self-evident.
Wait a second. Again, we've kept them on the other side of the Euphrates River. We have been very responsible. And the whole idea was, if the Turkish government was that concerned, why didn't they come in to fight ISIS back in 2014?
Okay, good point.
We had to do it all by ourselves.
Okay, so let's ask Onur Erim. Onur, these people defeated Daesh in the past. They are the best bet to defeat Daesh, even though they might be the sister organization to the PKK. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Be pragmatic, defeat Daesh with these guys. What's Turkey's problem with that? Onur?
We will never enjoy the comfort of sitting in our warm houses when we want to back in D.C. and get involved in Middle East when we like to, and not get involved with Middle East when we don't like to. This entire Middle East, including the Kurdish areas, the Syrian areas, Iraq, Iran, is our backyard. They are our neighbors, and we will have to live with them hopefully till the end of time, as we have for hundreds of years. So what Turkey has to do, what Turkey does in the region, is always going to be very careful. We cannot just go in and do what we like to do every time something comes up, without calculating it very, very finely. So Turkey has been very to the point when it talked about its red lines. Again, I have been in the region many times in the last 2 years. If you are not able to connect YPG to PKK very clearly, obviously you have a very misunderstanding of the region and of both organizations. So I will not even go into that. But again, Turkey has been very, very careful when they underlined their point about the region, their fight against Daesh, also known as ISIS, and what they needed to do about PKK for years, and its new arm as YPG, PYD. So Turkey has been very clear about this. Turkey hasn't changed their mind. Again, I was asked a question a couple of days ago that by a Western reporter as to, well, I can understand why Turkey was very much against getting involved with Russia just a couple of months ago about everything going on with Syria right now, and now they are they're back in bed with Russia for the region. Well, Turkey has to do this. Turkey hasn't changed its policy from day one about the region. It hasn't changed its policy about YPG in the region from day one. If they can't do this with U.S., with EU, they will do this with Russia, with Iran, and maybe with China. Again, we are the only major country, major power in the region, along with Iran, who's keeping a very safe distance to the matter, but very close distance. And we will be here next month, next year,
tempted, yeah,
and 100 years later.
Certainly. Tough geography, Turkey has to live here. I'm tempted to broaden this argument out into, whether Turkey is turning towards these other countries and going away from the West and so on. I'm gonna refrain from doing so because I want to kind of stay on point and bring us back to the beginning to look at a possible way out of this spat between Turkey and the US. Now, there have been some punches thrown, verbal punches. However, Prime Minister Binali Yildirim has also thrown some encouraging words out there. Let's have a little listen to what he had to say.
States need to solve issues between them by talking to each other. There is no eternal friend or eternal enemy. The actions taken by countries should respect and benefit both at state and public level. If two countries are allies, punishing citizens by displaying disagreements is an inappropriate attitude and does not suit a big country like the USA, and it won't solve the differences between us. We invite the US to be right-minded. This issue needs to be resolved immediately. Our channels are open to all countries. We will continue to support peace in the region.
Matthew Bryza, when you hear that from Prime Minister Yildirim, does it encourage you?
It does very much. I mean, that sounds like a door that is cracked open and actually swung a bit open. Look, my understanding from a statement that President Erdogan, I think, made yesterday was that Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu was actually not consulted at all before the United States took this step to suspend visa issuances. So allies really don't treat allies that way. And I agree with the Prime Minister, with Prime Minister Yildirim, that this particular tool chosen by the United States, as I said in the beginning, damages the personal interests of common Turkish citizens who have nothing to do with this dispute. That's not the right tool to use. So at least there should be a, if need to be, tough-minded, serious discussion behind closed doors that puts all of these issues on the table.
Lawrence Korb, very finally, you think there's going to be a compromise around the corner?
Well, first of all, I think, I agree that nations don't have permanent friends or enemies, they have permanent interests. But the United States stands up for certain principles regardless. And that's why, for example, when there's no evidence against Gulen, that our Justice Department says they're not going to take that step. Similarly, when you go after someone who's working for the United States for no good reason, we're not just going to, put it aside. Now, having said that, I think we need to sit down and talk about all of these issues.
Okay. Clear fault lines of disagreement here. However, I think it was a healthy discussion. Matthew Bryza, Lawrence Korb, and Onur Erim, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead, Sweden's warm welcome freezes over as Europe's most refugee-friendly country speeds up sending asylum seekers home. And we speak to a former US ambassador to Russia about the Kremlin's expanding influence abroad. Welcome back. Home is the most important place in the world. That's the tagline for one of Sweden's best-known companies. And it's a sentiment that may resonate with the tens of thousands of refugees who've made Sweden their new home. For years, Sweden has permanently accepted far more asylum seekers per capita than anywhere else in Europe. But that warm welcome seems to have run out, with refugees facing an increasingly hostile public and government. Randolph Nogel went there to find out why in this second report in our special series from Sweden.
A last patch of resistance. For many of the Afghan refugees here, their fight to remain in Sweden has endured from the first days they arrived. Now they're using what may be their last to ask the government if they can stay. Their sit-in protest has stretched on for more than 7 weeks. But now the weather is turning cold, many have left, and time is running out.
Even if it kills us, we will still be out here. We would rather be here in the cold and deal with the authorities than to return to Afghanistan and be killed there.
Mahmoud, like many here, came to Sweden alone as a minor. He became separated from his family while making the long, difficult journey.
My brother, my sister, I doesn't know anything about them. Maybe they are died, maybe they are living.
He helped organize the protest because many fear they may be killed if they return.
In Afghanistan, that's Taliban, that's ISIS, that's Afghanistan government. They're criminal, and because of that problem, we cannot be in Afghanistan.
Erki has spoken up about the issue, and for good reason. He was once a refugee too.
I think in the Second World War, when I come here, Sweden was that time very poor. They have to ransom the food and everything here, but still they take care of us. They could take them. Now Sweden is rich country, more rich than ever. Now they say, oh, we can't pay that, so it costs too much. No, this cannot cost too much.
Erkki came from Finland when he was very young. He shared his experiences with Afghan refugees in Stockholm.
Sweden needs that in the future. That's the future for the Sweden, they want to send back. And this is very bad. And I know because I'm one of them people build up Sweden. When I told to the refugees in Stockholm, when you're 76 years old, you have to stay here and speak like I do now.
Once known as one of the most generous countries for welcoming refugees, the nation has introduced new policies that make it harder for some asylum seekers to get in and for others to stay. But what has affected the lives of Afghan asylum seekers in Sweden is the designation by the Swedish Migration Board of a number of provinces in Afghanistan to be safe, most notably the capital, Kabul.
There is a problem. In the website of Sweden, the government websites, it has been clearly written that Afghanistan is not safe for a Swedish citizen to move and be there. But they are sending our children. It is a big question mark for a democratic country that how you send the people to the death if you by yourself cannot go there.
Sweden is not the only European country with the policy of forced returns. Nearly 10,000 Afghans have been sent back, now at risk of death or torture, according to Amnesty International. The Swedish government has maintained all applicants for asylum will be treated fairly on a case-by-case basis.
The two parties that make up Sweden's coalition government are divided on the issue. The country's oldest political party, the Social Democrats, have denied calls for an amnesty, while the Green Party has said a political solution should be found so that the Afghan refugees can stay.
But for now, Sweden's policy means that they could face rejection at any time. Huddled around this memorial of the Swedish labor movement, they can only hope that Sweden restores its legacy as a haven for refugees. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers in Stockholm.
Well, joining me now from Gothenburg is Tobias Andersson. He's the spokesman for the Swedish Democrats' youth movement. And in Stockholm, we have Joar Forsell. He's the chairman of Sweden's Liberal Youth League. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Tobias.
Thank you.
In 2014, the Prime Minister, Reinfeldt, had made that famous speech saying, let's open our hearts to refugees seeking shelter. Did you have a problem with that speech?
Of course I did, and I don't think there's any secret that a lot of Swedes had a problem with that speech, because what the regular Swedes saw was a country torn apart by migration. And when Reinfeldt, our prime minister, used to say that we are able to welcome a lot of more peoples, very few actually agreed with him, and we have seen the problems that his speech and his policies caused us.
Okay, and then 3 years later, how do you feel that many more Swedes feel exactly like Tobias? Many more agree with him than they did 3 years ago. Does it suggest that what the Swedish people really wanted is a refugee and migration policy that was far less open?
I'm sad to hear that a lot of Swedes has the same ideas as Tobias, of course. I still believe that we have to open our hearts, and I still believe that all humans have a humanitarian obligation to help other people. And I also still think that a lot of Swedes do believe that an open migration policy is the right thing to do, both for humans and for the economy. We need more people to come here to work, and this is one of the solutions.
Yeah, Tobias, they spur your economy. What's your problem with that?
Well, I think since Joar still wants to open our hearts, that's the reason to why his party is struggling around 4 or 5% while we're at 20-25. But we got a massive low employment rate. We actually got the biggest gap in employment between native-born and immigrants in the entire EU. So to say that we only need more immigration to Sweden in order to solve those problems is an obvious lie.
So Joa, they went from basically nothing to 20% of support during this time, primarily because of the anti-immigrant rhetoric, and we're seeing the government taking steps to match what they want more than what you want, right? We're seeing, border controls came back in, family reunification got tighter. We're seeing a lot of Afghans get expelled and deported. So, I mean, realistically speaking, is he more in touch with what the Swedish mainstream want rather than you?
No, I don't believe so. You still got to remember that most parties do not agree with him. I think that he's way too extreme in a lot of his views, and most Swedes do not vote for the Sweden Democrats, so they are still in a huge minority. And there is also the thing that a lot of Swedes still want the EU to be open. I agree that a lot of other EU countries has to take more responsibility. I agree that there has to be a lot of more EU countries taking in a lot of refugees. But I do not believe that Sweden or the Swedish population wants to take less responsibility than we do today. I still believe that in order to build wealth in a long term, we need to have more people coming to Sweden. We need to have more people coming to live here, coming to drive up consumption here, coming to work here, and this is one of the ways to do this.
Yeah, Tobias, we're seeing people from Afghanistan, people from North African countries being sent back home because they're not meeting a lot of the standards. There's multiple criteria. So I'm guessing you agree with that. What about the Syrians, for example, when it can be unequivocally proven that somebody has fled war and persecution? Somebody lived in a place like Raqqa, fled war and persecution, and is coming to Sweden to start a new life and wants to contribute to the economy, wants to learn Swedish, and is a refugee fleeing for their lives. Would you at least accept that that person needs to be in Sweden?
We don't want to take in further asylum seekers, but what we do want to do is to go through the UNHCR's refugee resettlement program, which leads us to that we have the fact that these persons are by the UN a refugee. We want to take in those kind of refugees. But what we see right now, and it's funny because Joar speaks so well about the EU, that if we actually follow the Dublin Treaty decided by the EU, which says that you're supposed to apply for asylum in the first EU country you enter, we wouldn't have any asylum seekers at all. Because I don't think anyone believes that you can travel all the way from Syria through Turkey and then through the entire European Union and up to Sweden. And let's be honest, they don't come here for the good weather, they come here for the benefits. And we need to actually say no to that, and instead we need to direct our financial aid to the local area and help them there. That's where we can make the most impact and help as many as possible.
Okay, so it's an argument that I've heard before by many on the right and often the far right in Europe, saying, hey, our benefits, our welfare states need to be for us, for our people, not for outsiders coming in. We can't look after our own. Why are we trying to look after other people? You made an economic argument for refugees coming in earlier on. What about that economic argument? Do you have sympathy with that, Joar?
Well, I do have sympathy with the refugees coming here, and I think that we all as humans have a humanitarian obligation, as I said before. And I think that if you look at the welfare, then you need people to work in the welfare as well. And if you look at the Swedish welfare today, you have a lot of the bus drivers are from other countries, a lot of the nurses are from other countries, a lot of the doctors are from other countries. We have a situation where we can't fill the spots in the welfare to make the welfare work. If we want to have a good health and a good education for a lot of people and a good bus service for a lot of people in Sweden, then we need people to come here to work. That's a fact. If you look at the biggest regions in Sweden where they hire a lot of doctors, a huge percentage of them are born in another country. And I do believe that if people come here and we manage to get them educated and manage to get them into jobs, then both the economy and the welfare state will actually benefit, rather than from Tobias' point of view, it will be drained.
So Tobias, why not work harder at integration to the benefit of everybody rather than shutting the door?
We have tried that already. We've seen how both the current and the former government has tried their best to solve the case. None of them admitted that the amount of immigrants arriving in Sweden actually makes a difference when it comes to our capability to integrate them. Because the thing is that you can't have massive immigration and a strong welfare system. And in this case, Johan needs to choose. And if he wants to ruin the Swedish welfare system, that's up to him. Because I want to be able and promise good health care to our citizens. I want to be able to promise our elders a good end to their lives. And I want to be able to promise our kids a fantastic future thanks to our schools. But I can't do that right now. And the main reason is that we've spent way too much money on immigration instead of our welfare.
Joar, you can't have both at the same time, says Tobias. Tell me why you disagree.
I do believe that educating people who come to Sweden from other countries as refugees, for example, is an investment and not only a way to spend money. And I also do believe that politicians on all levels, all political levels in Sweden, put money into different programs, put money into different policies that are not supposed to be in the welfare, that are not supposed to be made by politicians. I do believe that the government spends too much money on a lot of different things. But I do also think that we can save the core, we can save and we can actually develop the main parts of the welfare system and still take a lot of refugees in. It's true that the government needs to cut down on a lot of some things, but that would be true even if we did not have refugees, because the government does far too many things today.
Tobias, why don't you want your country to become a, quote, humanitarian superpower as it wants to be?
Well, because the term has been created by the left, and I don't think that you are a humanitarian superpower if you can't even get, for an example, good health care. You need to stand in line for months for an operation. If you go in on an emergency, you might be standing in line for 10 hours to actually get a treatment. And I don't think you're a humanitarian superpower if that's how you treat your citizens. And I also believe there's something wrong when you believe that you're a humanitarian superpower based on how many you actually allow to come to Sweden and not on how many you actually help. With our policies, we would help a lot more because we would focus our aid to the local areas where there's a lot more effective to help.
Tobias, there are those who fear your organization as the sort of noisy, racist right. Is there any truth to that?
Well, of course, if you have a situation in which a new party is gaining a lot of advantage in the polls, the other parties will do their best to blame them for all kind of things in order to gain and keep their voters. And unfortunately, we have, since we've been going up so fast in the polls, we had some people who shouldn't be in our party searching membership and entering our party, but we're taking care of that. And if you look at our policies, there is nothing that could be considered to be racist.
Okay, are you convinced that they're not racist and xenophobic?
No, I'm not, and I do also disagree with Tobias on the idea that Sverigedemokraterna, the Sweden Democrats, is a new party. It's an established party. They have a lot of percentage in the parliament. Tobias and all his friends in his parties are established politicians. But you have to still remember that when his party leader joined the party, they still used Nazi uniforms in their meetings. And a lot of people that have joined the party during the years have done so coming from different backgrounds, from different kind of racist backgrounds, from different Nazi backgrounds, from different backgrounds that are not, in fact, democratic. So I would not agree with Tobias on this issue. I do believe that there are an established party, but I do believe they still have racists in the party and they still have Nazi roots for the party. And I do believe that this party is in that way a threat to Sweden and to, of course, the democracy. Some of his party members have done remarkable, have said very strange things and have said very undemocratic things and still believe in some racist ideologies. So I do not agree with Tobias on this.
Tobias?
Well, the funny thing when Joar claims all these things, all this nonsense, is that we actually got more immigrants voting for us than the Liberal Party has. And I think that speaks for itself.
It's really fascinating. Yesterday we spoke about Sweden's war games, right? Which is directly pegged to what Russia's been doing in Belarus and the questions of Swedish non-alignment, right? And Sweden not wanting to take sides in different conflicts and maybe Sweden spending more on defense. Are we finding ourselves, you are in the year 2017, with all these various things happening around Sweden, that the country is now facing an identity crisis? It's asking very deep questions about what it means to be Swedish and where it wants to go as a country from here on in. You are?
That might be true. I do believe that Sweden, from my point of view, I do believe that Sweden wants to be an integrated part of the world, and that means taking in refugees. That also means cooperating with other EU countries with taking in refugees. But that also means that you have to choose sides in different international conflicts. From my point of view, we should join the NATO, for example, and I do believe that Sweden has to accept that we're not an isolated island, and that we need to be integrated with the rest of the world on each and every level, economically, when it comes to refugees, when it comes to the military, and so on.
Yeah, really interesting times in Sweden, and it's been a pleasure talking to both sides of the debate on this particular issue. I thank you both for joining us, Joar Forsell and Tobias Andersson. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We also need to recognize that today, contrary to Helsinki Final Act principles and international law, Russia continues to threaten stability in Europe, including by violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors.
The new U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Huntsman, has put Moscow on notice. He's told the Kremlin that at the top of the White House's priority list is a return of Crimea to Ukraine. Russia has supported separatists in eastern Ukraine since 2014, and the ensuing fighting has led to more than 10,000 deaths. Now, Huntsman's comments come while White House officials are under suspicion for colluding with Russia to influence the 2016 US election. And while some call it a smokescreen, there's no denying the regional perception that Russia's influence is growing, whether it's next door or in the Middle East. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Alexander Vershbow. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia under George W. Bush and was also an assistant secretary of defense under Barack Obama and more recently, the deputy secretary general of NATO. Sir, pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. When the new ambassador to Moscow, John Huntsman, says Russia should give back Crimea, should get out of the Donbass, is it easier said than done?
Well, definitely it's easier said than done, but I think Russia has to decide whether it wants to have a normal relationship with the United States and with the West again, or whether it wants to remain an international pariah state that is known for violating international law and using violence against its neighbors in violation of all the rules of the game. The Crimean situation, of course, may be especially difficult to resolve in the short term, but Putin could be put to the test right now in dealing with the eastern Ukraine situation. He recently put out a peacekeeping proposal, which everyone interprets as something of a ruse, but it could be the beginning of a bargaining process that could lead to a political solution in which the Russians would get out of the Donbass. Right. I hope that's the case, but I can't say I'm very optimistic.
Right, so yeah, you mentioned that peacekeeping proposal from Putin saying he doesn't mind, or he's willing to negotiate UN peacekeepers there. Then we also had this meeting that happened in Belgrade. Kurt Volker on the one side and Vladislav Surkov on the other. They spoke about a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. Putting those things together sounds as if Russia wants to get out maybe, but still retain a bit of a buffer. Will there be some sort of compromise? Because that would mean compromising some of Ukraine's territorial sovereign integrity. Is that possible at all?
Well, any deal would have to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, at least as far as the eastern Ukrainian provinces are concerned. I think the answer, though, to your question is maybe. We have to test Putin at the bargaining table. I'm very glad that the administration chose Kurt Volker, a really experienced and realistic diplomat, to lead its efforts, working with Germany, France, and, of course, with the Ukrainians themselves. we may not see any clear evidence of a breakthrough until after the Russian elections in March, after President Putin has got a new mandate under which he maybe, I repeat, maybe could be persuaded to at least hand back the Donbass and allow Ukraine to begin to live a normal life and not face the daily shelling of rockets and artillery. But again, he has to decide whether he wants to reverse his aggression. First, he has to admit that he's got his forces in there. Right now, Russia pretends it doesn't even have troops in eastern Ukraine, so it's a very difficult situation.
When General Mattis and others talk about arming Ukraine with defensive weapons, would you accept that from the Russian perspective, there's no such thing as defensive weapons? They are always going to see those as attacking weapons, as the West wanting to attack them.
Well, the Russians clearly aren't happy about the increasing talk of expanding military assistance to Ukraine. The Obama administration gave some technologies, certain radars and communications equipment, but they didn't give lethal weapons like anti-tank weapons. So I think for the Russians, they have to face the reality that if they don't negotiate a deal on the Donbass, the situation could get worse for their own forces. They could face much greater casualties if they continue to lob missiles at the Ukrainians. They're going to get hit back in the future.
Right.
And I think this might provide a little bit of an incentive for Putin to negotiate. So I'm glad the administration is at least talking about that.
Yeah, so and let's broaden this out now as I try to tap into your expertise on Russia and why Russia might do what it does. Why do you think Russia is in Syria?
Well, I think Russia's immediate goal in intervening 2 years ago in Syria was to save the Assad regime from collapse. And I think that was partly a message to the United States that we're not going to get away with a regime change operation as we did in Iraq and later in Libya. But I think Russia's ambitions have grown after the success of its initial intervention, and it's now trying to reestablish a more prominent, influential position in the broader Middle East. It's now got permanent bases, both Air Force bases and naval bases in Syria, and it's engaging more directly, as we just saw with the King of Saudi Arabia visiting Moscow, playing around in Libya. So Russia is trying to become a bit of a global power again. But there's, again, a domestic reason for this. The Russian people no longer are getting much improvement in their standard of living, so Putin's feeding them a kind of a tonic of nationalism and Russian greatness in order to divert attention from his increasing failures to deliver prosperity at home.
Okay, so the reasoning might be domestic, but I've spoken to perhaps more than a dozen experts who all tell me that with Obama wanting to be everyone's friend in the region and Trump wanting to put America first, there's a vacuum that's been created in the Middle East. Russia is filling that vacuum, and maybe Russia might not even be filling it. Maybe it already has filled it. You mentioned King Salman going to Moscow, and maybe now Putin is the indispensable player in the Middle East. Is that just a nice theory, or is that true?
I think he's more influential, but I think we shouldn't exaggerate Russia's influence overall. In terms of its power projection capability, it's really at its limits in Syria. They tried to show off their one aircraft carrier, which is totally obsolete. So they don't have the ability to project power the way the United States does. But the U.S. needs to figure out its strategy in the Middle East. I think if there's a vacuum, it's more that the U.S. is leaving the field open for Russia and its allies, such as Iran, to expand their influence. The U.S. has so prioritized fighting ISIS, which of course deserves to be crushed, but they haven't figured out what's going to happen the day after ISIS collapse, whether it's in Syria or in Iraq. Right now, it looks like it's going to become a protectorate of Iran with Russian support, and leaving the U.S. On the sidelines trying to figure out what happened. So the U.S. needs a strategy, but I don't think Putin is 10 feet tall. I think the U.S. can continue to exert influence in the region if it gets its act together.
And very finally, I just want to recoil this back to the U.S. domestically. Some people believe that any tough talk on Russia from the Trump administration is just a smokescreen in order to deflect from what many in the U.S. believe is the fact that Russia meddled in the U.S. elections and helped hand the presidency to Donald Trump. What's your take on that?
No, I think the tougher talk on Russia which has been a change. At the beginning of the administration, President Trump was still behaving in a very friendly way towards Russia. I think it reflects a greater understanding of the challenge that Russia poses, both on the ground in places like Ukraine, in Syria, but also in terms of its direct frontal assault on our democratic systems. Now, the President himself is still in a bit of denial about that. He still calls the interference stories a hoax. But Governor Huntsman, whom you just had on, all the key players in the administration, including Tillerson and Mattis, recognized that Russia directly interfered in our election. We don't know yet whether they tipped the balance or not, but it clearly was a kind of act of political aggression that we can't allow to stand. So I hope the administration ultimately will strengthen our defenses against this sort of interference and negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. Then we can get to the kind of better relationship that President Trump talked about during his campaign. It's not through concessions, but it's through strength.
Alexander Verschbauer, it's been great to pick your brain on these issues. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. And that is all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Don't forget to hit the like, follow, and subscribe buttons. Next time, violence in Kenya may cost top election officials their jobs. Is this a blow to the country's democracy? Well, until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.